Good morrow, nerds. It is I. Normally on Mondays, I would have two activities to look forward to. The first being recording a new video, and the second being playing Pathfinder. But today, I only have the first of those. So, what happened to Pathfinder? How did my experience go of it? And why did it come to such an abrupt end? But before I tell you the story of what must be one of the most cursed campaigns that I have ever been in, I have 3 buttons that I'd love it if you'd click, and those are like, subscribe, and the bell for notifications. 2 quick notes before we start. First, I'm not really going to do a big overview of the Pathfinder mechanics. I already did a video with my first impressions and predictions about the system, and I go over the mechanics there, so you can go watch that. The second is a note on editions. My group and I have been playing Pathfinder 2nd edition. I'm aware that the remastered edition is out and it has some small rules, tweaks and improvements. We were not using those because we were playing with the books that we had. And so our story begins. As I mentioned back in my previous Pathfinder video, I went almost the entirety of 2023 without being a player. I GM'd 5 different RPG systems in that time, but right up until December, I had not sat down as a player. Until one day, a friend, actually one of my players from my regular Cyberpunk group, offered to run Pathfinder for a bunch of us. The initial plan was to run Rise of the Runelords, converting it over from 1st to 2nd edition, until the GM realized how difficult converting from 1E to 2E was, and decided to run us through Menace under Otari instead, which I believe is the adventure in the Pathfinder beginner box, although I haven't checked. And so it was that we all sat down to make our characters. We had obviously our gamemaster, who is also the YouTuber Darkly Yours. You can go check out his channel. He's not uploaded too much recently, but you encourage him to do that because he really should be. We also had myself and 5 other players. Now, normally I don't like being in 6-player groups. I find them a bit slow and chaotic, but since A, I hadn't been a player in so long, and B, these were my friends, I decided to make an exception for it. Arguably the first mistake that all of us made in this campaign was our characters. I'll start with myself. For context, most of the PCs that I have ever played have been some flavor of charismatic sociopath, which is rather strange since I'm not even remotely charismatic. But that all aside, I decided to flip the script this time. I would play a gentle, kind, lawful good, non-violent character. And so I made a human angelic sorcerer with absolutely no weapons or damaging spells, or even debuffs. Okay, to be fair, the heal spell does let you damage undead, but that's an edge case. And you know what, I will admit, I was playing a very weird, high concept character, and I would not get the full experience of how the system worked. As we'll see, that bit me in some places, but less than you would think. Now let's move on to the rest of the players. We did have 2 other players from the Cyberpunk campaign that I'm running who were part of this group as well, and their characters were no less ridiculous. The most ridiculous character ended up being the half-orc thaumaturge. If you don't know what a Pathfinder thaumaturge is, don't worry, none of us know either, and we spent session after session with this character. It has something to do with magical abilities that come from objects, and it uses the occultism skill, I think. And there's 2 different versions of the rules, one in the playtest, one in the actual book, although I don't know which book it is. And it has various analysis and debuff abilities that we had to check the wording for every time they were used. Oh, and to top it all off, the player gave the character a name that was a first name in Klingon, including the mixed case, and a last name in Hebrew, to make sure that it was nice and unpronounceable for all of us. The way I got around this out of character was to call that PC weird name a bitch, and in character to just call the PC you. The other regular player made a character that should have been sensible, but turned out not to be. This PC was a half-elf wizard. Simple enough, nothing clever, fiddly. There was a familiar, but it's fine, just a wizard. And then you realize something when you actually look at the spell list. This player did not take a single damage or debuff spell that required a spell slot. He did have damaging cantrips, but nothing more powerful than that. Put a pin in this because it will come up later. Beyond myself and the 2 regulars, we also had 3 other players that I had not played with before. I had met one of them briefly in voice chats here and there, but the other 2 were total strangers. One of them made a Wood Elf rogue. Theoretically, a simple, sensible character, but her sheet was perennially broken, and she seemed to completely ignore all the special abilities that rogues are meant to have, other than knowing that she could add dexterity to damage as a thief, but beyond that I never once saw her use sneak attack. Continuing in the vein of having a character they didn't know how to use, we have the Halfling Ranger. I don't know what the Ranger's hunt prey ability was, and I don't think the player knew either. The Ranger did have a pet leopard named Death, because Of course it would be. Along with a rope dart, which is a kind of weird but kind of nifty weapon. It's strange. It does things. I don't know why she picked it. And finally we had the Tiefling Cleric. I guess human Tiefling Cleric. Tieflings in Pathfinder are a sub-race that's available to any race, or a heritage available to every ancestry to use the proper terminology. This character was a cleric of some neutral thingy. I can't remember. But with our motley crew of high-concept, badly understood misfits fully created, we set off for the village of Otari. Otari is apparently a village somewhere in Galarian that is known for two things: fish and a library. I don't know why an out-of-the-way village would have a large library, as out-of-the-way villages usually don't have enough foot traffic to warrant a huge library, and settlements with large libraries usually end up with enough foot traffic that they don't stay small and out of the way for long. But regardless, we all received a letter requesting our assistance from a certain Tamale. Tamale was a halfling fishmonger. And yes, a reminder to my fellow players, she was in fact called Tamale. I know we kept calling her the Fish Shorty, but she did in fact have a name. She even had a last name, but I'm going to make you go back through the Discord chats to go find that one. Now, our dear friend Tamale the Fish Shorty had a bit of a problem. Specifically, strange noises coming from her basement that were keeping her up at night. And she offered us money if we would help her silence these noises, whatever they were. At this point, we didn't yet know. And so we followed her down the steps into the basement and were promptly attacked by kobolds. I would say that we fought them off, but I was playing a fully pacifist character, so all I did was heal people up when they got damaged fighting them off. But the rest of the party, oh, they did a very good job fighting the kobolds off. That was one of the quickest, easiest encounters that we had all campaign. And then we followed it up with one of the hardest. You may be wondering, what could possibly stymie a group of 6 intelligent, attractive, skillful adventurers that would hold us up for an entire hour in out-of-character time? A ledge. It was literally a ledge with a 10-foot drop. Now, in the interests of not wanting to take 5 falling damage, we attempted to descend carefully with rope and skill rolls, and indeed rolls to aid, which my character was very good at, because she had good survival skills, and a feat called Cooperative Nature that gave her +4 to aid, which meant that my character could comfortably hit the DC 20 for an AIDS check. Unfortunately, even when she did hit that, it only gives a +1, and so about half the party, even with my help, ended up failing their athletics to climb down and taking falling damage. And then, after all of this, it was my turn to descend. And so, to return the favour, the rest of the party did opt to give me aid checks. Unfortunately, most of them did not in fact have the Cooperative Nature feat, and did not get a +4 to aid, which means they were using skills rated at 4, 5 or 6 to attempt a DC 20 check. And in Pathfinder, if you fail a roll by 10 or more, you critically fail, and in the case of an aid, you give a penalty. Now, given the lack of skills that my allies had, and the relatively high difficulty for such low-level characters, yeah, they gave me a bunch of -1s, and I fell flat on my face. Thanks, guys. After dusting ourselves off and getting some much-needed treat wounds in, we headed further down the hall to a room that was covered in cobwebs. Giant cobwebs. Fresh giant cobwebs. But before we could determine if there was a spider or not, we ended the first session. Picking things up next session, we learned that this giant web did in fact contain an equally giant spider. And after a few rounds of other people doing their hardest to damage that spider, it was an incredibly dead giant spider. We did find some loot in this area, including the mummified skeleton of a kobold that the ranger decided to pick up and carry around like it was a baby for some reason. Yeah, that happened. But anyway, we continued along and found a fork in the path. We took, I believe it was the left path, and found ourselves at a door which was at the top of a 10-foot ledge. Now, I want to be clear so that this time everything went fine, and that any claims to the contrary are completely alleged and almost certainly false. I can confirm with absolute certainty that Weird Nameovich, that half-orc thaumaturge, definitely did not try to seduce the ledge, and that I definitely did not need to chastise Weird Nameovich for doing something that even his rocker boy from Cyberpunk would barely have been able to do. And so, after a definitely very simple climb up that 10-foot ledge, we found a shrine with some water that you could drink for healing in exchange for being sick, which is a really weird trade when you think about it, but oh well. Continuing on, we found more kobolds. And the party did even more killing. I really hope kobolds aren't an endangered species, because if they are, then we're in serious trouble with Galarian's WWF. It was at this point towards the end of, I believe, session 3, that we came to the puzzle. Now, I'm going to take a moment here to say I'm not a huge fan of puzzles in tabletop RPGs, and I tend not to use them. My recent experience of National Tabletop RPG with puzzles that made literally no sense does not improve my thinking on this, but even supposedly well-designed puzzles can end up being just a massive drag on time as players sit around confused trying to figure things out, which is exactly what happened to us. This puzzle, which I've nicknamed the Alice in Borderland puzzle because apparently that's where the Wood Elf Rogues player recognized it from, involved putting coins in hands in 2 sets of 3 to find which of 9 coins was real out of the 8 fakes. If it sounds confusing, that's because it genuinely melted my brain. Only she seemed to know what she was doing, and so the rest of us just ended up getting in the way. It was kind of a mess, but we did get through it. So well done to the rogue. Apparently hiding behind the puzzle which opened a door were even more kobolds. I say were because within a few rounds they were even more corpses. Is there a kill counter in Pathfinder? I know there's a kill counter cyberware in Cyberpunk, which you can use for a self-tracked kill count. Because if there is some equivalent, some say magic item, then with the amount of kobolds we killed, I think the party really needs one. Having explored the left branch of the tunnel to our heart's content, we continued on down the right path. But before we got the chance to do this, we lost one player and then a second. The first player to go was that Tiefling Cleric. I won't really go into the details because 1, it would be a bit disrespectful, and 2, I don't fully have them. But suffice it to say that there was a falling out between the Cleric's player and the GM, and he was booted from the game. The next player to go was that Halfling Ranger. She had personal issues that came up in her life and she wanted to step away from the game, and step away she did. And so when we finally explored the right branch of the tunnel, we did so with just 4 characters, although only 3 players, since the Thaumaturge's player wasn't there that session. And finally, we fought something that wasn't a kobold. It was skeletons. Spooky, scary skeletons. And then promptly very re-deaded skeletons. We actually got a neat little, what is it, like the Everburn torch from this room. Nice little magic item. We did get some other items here and there, a healing potion, some gold coins, some silver coins, some gems. The loot in this adventure thus far have been okay, but not really worth mentioning. Although it did cause an argument between the wizard and the rogue at one point, which resulted in an opposed thievery roll that the wizard somehow won. I know, the rogue lost at thievery. We truly are living in the downfall of Western civilization. And then the campaign went on hold. Part of this was the GM and that player falling out, causing the GM to have a bit of reflection and to need some time away. Part of this was the game being thrown into jeopardy by the Thaumaturge leaving just the rogue, the wizard, and myself. And then even beyond that, we had a hard time with scheduling. You see, when we started this campaign, we were playing it in the evening British time, which was basically fine as we were all in either the US, where it was the afternoon, UK, where it was the evening, or in the Middle East, where it was also the evening. However, the rogues player went from the UK to India, and suddenly then the session start time was at midnight. And for some reason, midnight on a Monday was a bit difficult for her to be awake for. How shocking that someone would try to have an actual intact sleep cycle. This is unacceptable behavior. And so we ended up moving the session time forwards to early afternoon British time, which is mid-afternoon Middle Eastern time, and early morning American time. Finally, a time we could all make, except we couldn't. As it turns out, our GM is a bit of a narcoleptic, and even in my D&D and Cyberpunk campaigns, has a habit of sleeping through the first hour or 2 of sessions. And so, when he voluntarily decided to set the game starting time to 9 AM his time, apparently it was difficult for him to be awake at 9 AM his time, and so we missed an entire session for that. But finally, eventually, we had a session where all we really did was level up and then go down some stairs. That was literally it. We spent most of the time leveling up our characters, or I should say, the rest of the party spent a lot of time leveling up their characters. I got my whole thing done in half an hour. I had a build laid out for my character, and I knew all the rules and how to use the Roll20 sheet, and I had no issues. The rest of the party, yeah, they needed some hand-holding. But hooray, woohoo, we were level 2! And so we started the next session with a fight between our 3 remaining player characters and 2 kobolds guarding the entrance to the second level of the dungeon. Now, I need to take a step back and explain something. You see, our combats up to this point had been quite long, Part of this comes from having a 6-player group. With so many players who all need a turn, combat will drag. Another part comes from Pathfinder. Pathfinder's mechanics are generally well designed and mostly well written, with the exception of the thaumaturge. However, there is a lot of mechanics to get through. There's a lot of interactions, keywords, abilities to search through. And to top it all off, because of the 3-action system, you can find yourself doing a lot of things. Now, to be fair, you can do a turn in under a minute. And I routinely did my turns in under a minute. But on the whole, our combats could be pretty slow. Now, part of me had hoped that as we shed players, our combats would get faster, and our 1-hour combats would become 40-minute or even half-an-hour combats. But they never did. Even after the group size started to shrink with the first couple of players leaving, our combats were still taking an hour. And this fight with the kobolds took an hour and a half. We had 3-player characters, all of whom had been playing for more than half a dozen sessions, and 2 CR1 enemies. This should not have been a long fight, but it took an hour and a half. It didn't even take that many rounds, it was just slow. We had a lot of player indecision, a lot of needing to look up the rules because people just didn't know them, and a lot of non-responsiveness. People would ask the GM a question and have to wait for an answer, or the GM would ask the players a question and also not get an answer. And so we come to last Monday. I put up a message in our Discord asking, hey, is the session still on? Because I hadn't heard anything from the GM in the last few days. And instead of hearing from him, I hear from the Wizards player. He tells me that he's leaving the group. He explained that, for one thing, this slot wasn't nearly as convenient for him as he had hoped, as mid-afternoon in the Middle East often clashed with his university lectures. And the other issue was the campaign just dragging on. The fact we made so little progress, barely managing one combat a session for multiple sessions in a row, with those combats dragging on and being slow-paced slogs. And he said he just wasn't enjoying things anymore. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how the campaign died. That is the story of Pathfinder. So, what went wrong? The first thing that has to be blamed is the characters. A lot of the character decisions that were made were dumb. I will admit, a character who can't do any attacks was a dumb decision for me to make. But my character wasn't that bad overall. She was very effective at healing, especially with the treat wounds, and she was able to keep everyone basically at or near full HP for the entire duration of the campaign. She was also able to provide aid in various situations, like that ledge and a few other places. And so, while she didn't always fight, she did make herself useful. The big issue I had with her was actually initiative. I didn't have a particularly high wisdom or perception, but for some reason I kept rolling really high on initiative and often kept going first in combat. And being a non-combat character who focuses on healing, I found myself having to immediately delay my turn until someone would be damaged, and then I can take the turn after them and heal them back up. That was what I did for a lot of combats. There were occasions where, say, I couldn't find uses for a third action, which to be fair also happened to the thaumaturge at least once. But on the whole, as a one-trick pony, she did her one trick very well. The issue is that she couldn't really do anything else. I had planned that eventually she might find herself in some situation where she was forced to use violence, and that at that point, the taboo would end and she would actually start fighting, but that moment never came. The wizard actually tried to convince my sorceress to actually contribute violently, and so I asked him to roll a persuasion check. He rolled it was a crap roll, and so she used the brief moment at the end of the 6-second round to cry a single tear and tell him no. And so it was that my character gained the reputation for doing nothing and crying, which, you know what, isn't that bad a reputation. As for the wizard, he did contribute in combat using the acid splash and telekinetic projectile cantrips, but that was all he did. He had no damaging spells. He didn't even take new damaging spells at level 2, even though he probably could have put them in a spellbook. I don't know why he did that, but what it meant is that he was stuck using 2-action spells that could do okay damage, but that weren't really that exceptional, and so he was fairly lackluster. The Ranger and Rogue were both fairly well-made characters that were severely underutilized. More so the Ranger than the Rogue, but even the Rogue had this issue. The Cleric was an interesting case. From what I can tell, she used her character about as well as she could have, but she complained about everything that her character could and could not do, making some very unfavorable comparisons between D&D and Pathfinder in the early sessions, although full credit to the player, she did eventually calm down on that front. And then we come to the thaumaturge. The thaumaturge was a mess. Neither the player nor the DM ever fully understood what the character did, and they came far closer to that goal than any of the rest of us. If you remember that fight with the skeletons, where the thaumaturge's player was away for that session, I was the one who ended up controlling the thaumaturge, and I just used his hand crossbow for everything. It was just easier. I think I actually tried using some of his abilities in the first round or two, and then realized that no, that wasn't worth doing. The second problem we had was really a table issue of a weird mix of long periods of silence and everyone then talking over each other. We all had very poor mic discipline, which if you're playing online using voice chat, you really do need good mic discipline. And so yeah, we'd end up talking over each other, creating chaotic messes which were hard for the GM to deal with. And as I said earlier, there were often cases where, players would ask something and the GM would be off doing something and not respond for ages, or the GM would ask the players a question and they wouldn't respond for ages, which really slowed the game down. Now, as I've commented to both the GM and to the Wizards player, I as a GM have a solution for this particular problem, at least on the non-responsive player side, which is, if you start dithering or being slow, I count down from 10. If I hit 1 and you haven't made the decision, your turn ends. This is incredibly brutal and incredibly stressful, especially when you consider that I deliberately start the countdown in the middle of the player's sentence to throw them off, but it works. It gets players to make decisions. The GM actually considered using this, but the campaign fell apart before he got the chance. There was also an issue with people not knowing the rules, which is normal in a tabletop RPG, especially when you're first learning it, but we never really got all that far into learning. We consistently had issues with players not knowing they even had abilities, having abilities but not knowing how to use them, or some other issue or other that needed to be searched through in the book that took a long time, especially because of the aforementioned non-responsiveness. This more than anything is what turned combat into such a slog, the fact that turns that could have been quick ended up being incredibly slow. I don't really think that Menace under Otari is at fault here. I made a few jokes at its expense here, but really, it's fine, it's okay. I've not seen the whole thing, I can't tell you how it goes, how it ends, but it's fine, it exists. As for Pathfinder itself as a system, again, it's adequate, but it's not really my cup of tea. Pathfinder being in the mold of the D20 fantasy class level roller thing out of thing systems has a bunch of the problems that are inherent to those systems. For one thing, ability bloat. Even at lower levels, you do have a whole bunch of abilities that you sometimes will use, sometimes won't use, sometimes will understand, sometimes won't understand. But the one thing that you can guarantee is that your abilities and everybody else's will be completely different, and so everybody is learning separately and no one can really benefit from each other's learnings. Unlike, say, Cyberpunk, where apart from the role abilities, which really do take a back seat, almost everything is done with a skill system, so there's a nice common language between how every player does everything. One thing that I noticed with Pathfinder, both from observing other players' turns and also from the times when I took over both the Ranger and the Thaumaturge for sessions, is the incredibly high whiff factor that attacks have. In most cases, unless you're a fighter, at level 1 and 2, you're rolling 2 plus your level, plus an ability score modifier that's usually somewhere in the range of +1 to +4, plus 1d20, against an AC that is 10, plus 2, plus a level which is usually 1 or 2, plus an ability modifier that's like 1 or 2. Now, what this means is that generally speaking, your first attack will have anywhere from a 60 to a 40% chance of success, which means there's a fairly high whiff chance. But then your next attack has a -5 modifier, and so now you're looking at like 35 to 15% chance. And your last attack of the round, well, that'll have a -10 modifier, and now you can basically only hit on a natural 20. What this means is there's actually pretty good odds that you fail every single attack on your turn, even if you use all 3 actions for attacks. On the one hand, this does speed up combat, as if you're doing nothing, that's pretty quick. But on the other hand, it does leave a lot of character turns feeling fairly lackluster. The fact you can try and fail so many times in a row is just a bit ridiculous and dispiriting. The 3-action system also has the lovely benefit of basically penalizing you for doing anything other than attacking. I know that a lot of Pathfinder fans don't see it that way, but it's kinda true. If you spend an action to move close to an enemy, you can then make 2 attacks against them, and on their turn they can make 3 attacks against you. If you stand still and wait for the enemy to approach, then they'll get 2 attacks against you, and you'll get 3 attacks against them. And then of course there's 3-on-3 slugging matches from then until one of you dies. On some level, it does reward a very reactive defensive style of play, which I'm not really a huge fan of, but really it's not that big an issue, it's just a small gripe I noticed. In terms of the rest of the mechanics, they're well executed, but uninspiring. I've never been the biggest fan of the D20 fantasy class level roller thing out of thing type of mechanics. And so even though I do consider Pathfinder's rules to be relatively well written and well executed, it doesn't really matter how well executed they are because they're not the sort of rules that I would want. Now, to be fair, I wouldn't mind playing Pathfinder again if it was with friends and if I was a player. It's not a game I would ever GM, and it's not a game that I would play with strangers. But as I said, it is a well done, well executed system. It at least has that much going for it. The final issue to mention was another issue from me, and that's backseat GMing. As noted, before this campaign started, I spent a lot of time GMing and hardly any playing. And so, my GM muscles were sharp and my player muscles were rather dull. As such, whenever there was an issue at the table, my fix-it instinct was very strong, whether that be fixing Roll20 sheets that I spent all of the first session doing, helping players with the rules, helping the GM with the rules, trying to serve as a go-between between the players and the GM when people were being unresponsive. But as the GM pointed out to me shortly before the campaign fell apart, I had become a bit of a crutch, and then in the end I probably had made the whole thing a bit harder for everyone. So yeah, note for next campaign, do not backseat GM. 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 So, to round this video out, this campaign was honestly cursed. In fact, that's what we were all calling it for the last few weeks of its sorry existence. As GMs, we often try to make our campaigns exciting and energetic, to start with a bang and end with a bang. But this campaign started with a groan and ended with a whimper. From the beginning, it was a slow-paced slog, where even a 10-foot ledge was enough to delay us for an entire hour in real life. We were constantly dealing with scheduling issues and player dramas. We had to move around our start time multiple times. And even when stuff was happening, it was all a bit banal. A bit of combat here, a bit of puzzle there, going up some stairs, going down some stairs. But the truth is, this is pretty close to the average RPG experience. I, as both a GM and a player, am always trying to make sure that I'm giving the best possible experience to everyone at the table, and running high-quality games with high-quality people. But the truth is, most tabletop RPGs are played by casual people, in casual groups, when nobody knows the rules, and it's mostly just people mucking about. It lasts for a few sessions until something causes it to fizzle, and then it ends. That shouldn't be the normal RPG experience, but it is. And you know what? Even I have had campaigns like this. And I don't even blame the players for it too much. The GM is a player on my Cyberpunk campaign, and he's very good. Most of the players are also on my Cyberpunk campaign, and they're also very good, and indeed very quick on the ball in my Cyberpunk campaign. We have our combats going at warp speed, and we can even get through multiple tasks in a single session. I think this was a case of bad luck. We had bad luck with scheduling, bad luck with the system, and while I do genuinely like pretty much all of the players, we had bad luck with each other. Sometimes, even when you put in your best, it just isn't good enough. Now, seeing as this group had a lot of players from my regular campaign, it inherited a lot of traditions from my regular campaign, and among them was recording out-of-context quotes. And so now I've picked out some of the best of them to read to you. Did you just put alignment hungry? Mouth breathe, like 30% more. I'm equal rights, so everyone is wearing panties. Did you ask if I was a nipple baby? I guess I was a nipple baby. Stop trying to change me! Can we keep all our crimes orderly, please? Thank you for having a backstory. Why is everyone always inventing new ways to fuck up? I don't know what you're doing with your hands already. It's a bit small. You get to touch people and they like it. You didn't buy clothes! I don't want clothes! She's either badass or really weird. I never wear underwear when I'm adventuring. That's disgusting. Staves. Eat your breakfast. Staves. What do you mean it's not a knife? GM, why are we kissing you? No casting fireball inside the house. I didn't know Canadians are afraid of rats. So, you can be a nurse from the waist down. We applaud you for stooping that low. Just say, answer me or I'll murk your character! I just unironically choked on a banana. If you ever see one, don't touch it, you will die. Yeah, sure, I will not call you mummy, I guess. Bro, it's not a man! You can take a spider to the bar, but I don't know how you'll make a drink. Currently, I'm its drink of choice. I take an action to take it out. That is long. Before rolling thievery. It's not stinging! I can't get up without being assaulted. Mummy, be quiet! I'm not dying to a fucking plastic. Apparently that quote was meant to be classic, but I was the one who transcribed it and I thought plastic sounded better, so suck it. That character was afraid of being killed by Regina George, and I refuse to believe any other version of the story. The door is made out of door? Imagine being a moron for that long. I have tried string, I have tried tasers, I have tried everything! You're saying we're the babies? We are basically mole people. I will never use your name again. As far as I know, could be flirting. GM, stop blinding me! Everyone's going to thwart me today. Roll for farts, I guess. Stop making the other players cry! Just lesbian things. I'm not complaining, but it's just hard sometimes. Wow, now I am pressured to study. I am selfish. I wish I had Alzheimer's. I have virgin activities at 8. I need to get me some GMing cocaine! I need Jesus. I don't need Jesus. Give me my corn! All I see is breast cancer. I am a dingus. That's so disgusting. That's like staves. That just proves how much of an idiot you can be. I love crawling. You're talking to yourself then? That's so rad. Alcohol is a poison. Cool. Whenever someone says something dumb, I always assume it's you. In the game, I have my father's feet. I can control you. I can be the nuisance. I didn't think Muslim in space would be that complicated. Crying is a free action. The GM has abandoned us. And with that final quote, we come to the end of this section. Were we really that unhinged? Yeah, we were. And it's a wrap. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please like it, share it with your friends, and leave a comment down below. What's your experience of Pathfinder? Or of Menace under Otari? What other mistakes do you think we made, and what could we have done better? If you'd like to see more videos like this one, then please subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. It really does help my ego, and the channel, and also my ego. My ego really needs some help at the moment with the deployment of the Pathfinder game falling apart. Not putting pressure on you, but putting pressure on you. And once more, thank you all so much for watching, and until I see you next, farewell.